I've been waiting for this year as everybody I'm sure knows, I have some sympathy with the position of taxing the resource base of a country more heavily than taxing the labour and capital base. I just think it's just so insane that a government attempts to tax workers and entrepreneurs like myself and capitalists, although others would call me a speculator sometimes, but that's okay. Why governments choose to tax that type of activity so heavily, so punitively. And I've been waiting for this year for a couple of years now, because in May of 1890, Henry George made a 16-day lecture tour in Queensland, giving 8 lectures in 5 locations. And I'm just reading now from an abstract that was written about Henry George's 16-day lecture in Queensland. It was written by John Pullen of the University of New England, who I don't know who he is, I've never met, but it was an interesting little couple of things to read. 1890, you see, and you might have noticed that the Premier of Queensland at that particular time was a fellow called subsequently Sir Samuel Walker Griffith. Do people know who Griffith was and what he did? Interesting how names get lost.
Griffith University.
Well, yes, it was named after him. Samuel Walker Griffith essentially wrote Australia's Constitution. So he's a fairly significant person in Australian history. Now, as it happens, Griffith was Premier of Queensland when Henry George did his lecture tour. As it also happened, Griffith's beliefs in land reform mirrored much of what Henry George had to say. And when you can see that when Australia's constitution was formed, and of course at the same time in 1901, when Australia had this big argument about what sort of capital city we'd have, you had people in Sydney fighting the people in Melbourne as to the capital city. There were a number of people on that constitutional convention, whatever they called it, back in 1900 and forward, that actually took up part of the Queensland model of what Henry George was talking about and what C.B. Dutton introduced. In other words, in Queensland, certainly for all the pastoral territories, you had to lease the land. And they did that so that the entrepreneurs of that state wouldn't be taxed as heavily. They also did it because by about 1890, most of Australia, certainly outside the city, most of Australia was owned by just a few pastoralists. Australia had to find a way to try and reduce the land holdings, because both, if you read part of what Dutton, if you read a part of what Griffith had to say, they wanted a stronger middle class in the country. That's what they were talking about. So hence, when you come through to 1901 and forward, in Canberra when it was established, you had to lease the land. And so you can see how things fed through. Now, I'm interested in that from a Ghan point of view, because May 1890, when Henry George is here, we come through now, we're at 2010, exactly 120 years later, which is the corner of the triangle within the circle, which is very important from a Ghan point of view. We now have the Ken Henry Review, which may, of course, suggest that Australia adopt a federal land tax. And the irony of that, which is why I mentioned it, the irony of that is, from the point of view of what the Prosper organisation might look at, which you might want to subsequently investigate, Kevin Rudd, as I understand it, holds the seat of Griffith in Queensland. So here we go. So, see, in a sense, and one of the other reasons I mentioned it is because Ghan believed history repeated, and he said that history repeated in set timeframes, which I know there are people in the audience, Dennis, Roy, and a few others. You've seen that categorically, so I would certainly not get any arguments from you guys because you've seen it. History never repeats exactly. You can never see it exactly, but it rhymes, and that's the rhyming that I'm seeing at the moment. And you've had multinational corporations like Qantas and other big companies. They've all come out and they have said they've actively supported a rent resource tax. Okay, so it's just going to be interesting to see how that unfolds. But the timing of that is there's an argument there in Australia that should be had. So I hope that Prosper's ready for that argument.